Robert Barron explains these as the archetypes of order and disorder. Like the garden is the place of flourishing, of delight for the senses. And the point of putting Adam and Eve in the garden is that God wants what's best for us. Okay? God wants to share his life, his love with us. Okay? It's like the pagan gods were more in it for themselves. Like Prometheus, when Prometheus brought down fire from heaven, the other gods were put out by him. That human beings were like rivals to God. Okay? Well, the true God, though, wants what's best for us. God is not in it for himself. So to live in the garden where the tree of life is in the center and it radiates life in that garden, it flourishes. Now also in that garden is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And from this, Adam and Eve may not eat. And the reason for that is it's the unique privilege of God to set the objective standard of truth. Okay? And God alone can determine what's good and what's evil. To eat of this tree is to take to oneself that right to determine what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. And that's the divine privilege that we can't take to ourselves. Okay? We can eat from any tree in the garden except from that one tree in the middle of the garden, the tree in the knowledge of good and evil, because that's to take to ourselves something that's not ours. There's this other analogy, like God is the director of creation. And there's a false director who enters in, Satan, and he tells Adam and Eve that he has better parts for them. He tells them, you will become God. You will become like God if you eat from this tree. And as soon as God becomes plural, the drama becomes a tragedy. Okay? Because God cannot have rivals. There can't be two gods. Okay? And so the devil tells Adam and Eve, God is not your benefactor, God is your rival. If you eat from this tree, you will not die. You will become like God. Okay? So the devil is trying to get Adam and Eve to think in terms of the old idea, the pagan idea, that God is our rival. He doesn't want what's best for us. He's looking out for himself, not for us. Okay? But that's the falsehood. Okay? The fundamental temptation then is the deification of one's own will, to make freedom absolute. Okay? To make freedom absolute. And that's the culture in which we live, when freedom becomes an absolute. In the Supreme Court, in the case of Casey versus Planned Parenthood in the 90s, ruled that part of their judgment was, it belongs to the nature of our freedom to determine the meaning of one's life and the meaning of the universe. Okay? That's original sin. Okay? To determine what's right and what's wrong for ourselves is the original sin. Like we call it today the gospel according to Jane Fonda. It's my body, I can do what I please with it. Okay? That's the original sin. Okay? To take myself the right to determine what's good and what's evil, rather than submitting to God's standard of truth. Okay? And when we do that, when we define good and evil for ourselves, it leads to the transformation of the garden into a desert. Life gets cut off. When freedom trumps the good, life dries up. The prodigal son, when he wanted freedom from the father, and what he found was famine, hunger. It wasn't pretty, okay? Because the desert is sterile. once we're cut off from God, we become restless wanderers. That's what Cain was called after he killed his brother Abel, a restless wanderer. It's the desert. Okay. So when I take to myself that right to determine what's good and what's wrong, then the world revolves around me. I am the center of the universe. Okay. And again, today, we have all kinds of man-made laws. The only sin in public school today is to get pregnant. Okay? And that's not God's law. That's man-made law. Man has to have laws, but we either follow God's laws or we make them up as we go along. Okay? So when we start making ourselves the arbiter of right and wrong, we make up our own rules, and they don't always reflect God's rules, God's law, God's truth. And so Eve ate from the tree. She gave the apple to Adam, and they became like rivals. Their focus was no longer on God but on each other, and in fact they had to cover themselves with fig leaves, and they realized they were naked. They had to cover their nakedness. Prior to sin, together they were in love with God. But after the sin, they had to protect themselves from each other. Okay? Eve had to protect herself from Adam. Okay? And that's the effect of original sin that continues in the world. Again, we become rivals. Now in the gospel, Jesus Christ presses the reset button. We got to try this thing over again. Jesus is led by this Spirit into the desert, okay, where he faces the same tempter that Adam and Eve had encountered. And the devil's strategy is the same. The devil wants to lure him into making human will superior to divine will, okay? To make my will, my sensual satisfaction, my honor, my power, above God's will, to let, like we say, my will trump good and evil. Okay? The temptation is to deify one's own will, to make that the almighty thing that we worship. Okay? And so no matter how much we desire something, freedom must be subordinated to the truth. Our freedom must always be subject to the will of the Father. Okay? That's the meaning of that Genesis and the gospel. Okay? We can live in the garden where we flourish. When we respect God's law, we flourish. Okay? But when we sin, the garden quickly becomes a desert. We can live in the garden or wander in the desert of lifelessness. And so Lent is the journey from the desert back to the garden. Okay? Jesus Christ takes us from this desert and wants to lead us back to the Garden of Gethsemane, but ultimately to the Garden of the Resurrection, where the resurrection took place. That's where he's leading us. There's a prayer this week in the liturgy that said, Lord, may everything we do begin with your inspiration, continue with your help, and reach completion under your guidance, referring to Lent. And so we can ask that this journey that begins in the desert might ultimately continue with God's saving help and reach completion in that garden of flourishing.